New York, 1983. A cold case solved. An arrest that split a small town. Rain stitched Main Street into mirrors. Blue lights washed the bricks. A kitchen lamp burned above a scarred table. A man sat there with cold coffee and a quiet face. Thomas Dyer. Detectives stepped in without raising their voices. One set an evidence bag on the wood. Inside, a brown tweed jacket. The lining split. A tiny handwritten code showed through the seam. If you like cases where one overlooked clue flips a whole town, you are in the right place. But to understand this moment, we need to go back to where it began. Here are the facts. Evelyn Hart, 29, florist and evening tutor, Cedar Hollow, New York. She locked her shop at 8:40 on a cold March night. 2 days later, road workers found her in a culvert 3 miles north. No robbery. One blow. The case froze. What broke it was small. A thrift store box from a tailor's estate. A jacket pulled from tissue paper. A seam that felt wrong under a thumb. Inside, in faded pencil, a repair code, M317. A retired tailor opened a ledger that had slept for 40 years. The same code. A name in neat graphite. Detectives reopened the file. Modern light coaxed a latent palm from the jacket's inner lining. Ridge for ridge, it matched Dyer. A plaster cast from the culvert kept cracked, nearly forgotten, lined up with his old work boots, chip for chip on the outer heel. A blurred night photo caught a car's taillight spacing in the water. The measurements fit his Ford. Benign contact was the first question. Clothes passed through hands. People borrow coats. The team walked the chain back to 1983. The print lived under the seam before the donation. The ledger tied the garment to a date. The tread tied the man to the mud. The timeline held. Arrest came quiet. No shouting. No struggle. Dyer watched the jacket in the bag and blinked once, as if at a memory. He said he fixed seams. He said very little else. In court, the ledger lay open under a lamp. The tailor's nephew read the line. The lab showed the palm in spectral light. The tread expert overlaid edges until the room stopped breathing. The jury went out. 2 days later, they came back. Guilty of second-degree murder. 25 years to life. What finally changed was attention. A code in pencil. A book that remembered. A jacket that kept a handprint alive. Hold one image. A detective turns a brittle page. M317. Graphite glows in a circle of yellow lamplight. Rain ticks the window like a slow clock finding its beat again. But to understand this moment, we need to go back to where it began. The bell above Hart's Flowers rang soft against the March wind. Morning light slanted through frosted windows, catching the dust on vases and the curve of green glass bottles. Evelyn Hart moved between the counters with easy rhythm scissors in one hand, ribbon in the other. She hummed when she worked, though no one ever recognized the tune. Just a low, steady melody that disappeared into the stems and water. Outside, Cedar Hollow stirred awake. A delivery truck rumbled past the diner, tires hissing on wet pavement. Somewhere, a dog barked once and then gave up. The town was small enough that you could cross it in 15 minutes, smaller still in winter when the tourists were gone and Main Street belonged to the locals again. 2 bars, 1 diner, a library, a post office, and the flower shop. That was the heart of Cedar Hollow in 1983. Quiet, polite, unremarkable. Evelyn had moved here 5 years earlier from Albany, chasing something softer than the city. She found it in a vacant storefront with a cracked tile floor and a single window that caught the afternoon sunday. She named the shop Hart's Flowers, a name that sounded warmer than it was. She worked alone most days, except on weekends when her friend June helped with deliveries. The locals liked Evelyn because she remembered things: birthdays, allergies, who preferred tulips over roses. She'd tape little notes to the inside of her register. Mrs. Kent, white lilies only. Mr. Bloom, no carnations. She kept secrets without realizing it. Her apartment sat just above the shop. 2 rooms, narrow hall, wood floors that creaked in the right places. From her window, she could see the clock tower across the square. At night, she'd grade papers for her evening tutoring class at the high school, sipping tea that always went cold before she finished. Evelyn taught English to adults who wanted their GEDs, men from the lumber yard, mothers who'd quit school young, She never complained about the hours. She liked the sound of pencils scratching in a quiet room. People in Cedar Hollow said she was kind but distant. Not cold, just private. She smiled easily but never too wide, as if saving part of herself for later. She'd been engaged once, rumor said, but no one ever saw the man. She wore no ring, kept no photos in the shop. Whatever that story was, it belonged to her alone. The town itself had a way of swallowing stories. Everyone knew everyone, but only up to a point. Conversations stopped at church doors and grocery aisles. Secrets lived in attics and barns, wrapped in the same patience the town used to survive long winters. Evelyn fit right in. She wasn't born there, but after a few years, no one cared. She joined the volunteer group that decorated the square every December. She sold small wreaths to raise money for the firehouse. She attended the Sunday market but never stayed long. Always polite, always smiling, always leaving early. If you walked past the shop on a late afternoon in March 1983, you'd have seen her bent over the counter, trimming the ends of yellow tulips. You'd have seen the bell above the door shiver when she turned the sign to closed. And if you'd looked closely through the window, you might have noticed a jacket draped over a chair tweed, light brown, with one sleeve stitched unevenly. She planned to take it to Mendel's tailor in the morning. The seam had split again, and Evelyn hated things that stayed broken. In Cedar Hollow, gossip moved slower than the seasons. The people there didn't need excitement. They preferred predictability. The paper, the Hollow Gazette, ran on small stories, school fundraisers, bake sales, high school sports. Crime barely made the front page. The last headline with real teeth had been a barn fire in 1978. Even that had faded fast. The police department shared a brick building with the post office. 3 officers, 1 dispatcher, 1 sheriff, who was already half retired. Cedar Hollow wasn't built for tragedy. That was part of its charm. Evelyn Hart's shop stood on the corner of Main and Willow, the best kind of address: central, visible, ordinary. Every Valentine's Day, the line out the door reached the sidewalk. Every funeral, every wedding, every graduation, Hart's Flowers supplied them all. If you'd asked anyone who Evelyn Hart was, they'd have said the same thing. She's the flower lady, nice girl, quiet. And yet, quiet people leave the loudest silences when they're gone. That's the thing about small towns. They build their safety on the idea that bad things happen somewhere else. Somewhere bigger, rougher, more anonymous. Not here. Not among us. That illusion would shatter one cold March night, and the cracks would never quite heal. Back then, no one noticed the man who lived 2 doors down from Evelyn's shop. Thomas Dyer rented the second-floor apartment above the hardware store. He repaired radios in his spare time, kept to himself, and paid cash for everything. He wasn't unfriendly, just invisible. People said hello. He nodded. That was enough. In a town like Cedar Hollow, you didn't need to know your neighbors deeply. You just needed to believe they were good. Evelyn believed that too. She sold Dyer flowers, once a single white lily. He said it was for a friend. She wrapped it in brown paper and thought nothing of it. Years later, detectives would find the receipt tucked inside an old ledger book from 1983. A small purchase. A name scrawled in faded ink. A moment that meant nothing until it meant everything. For now, in the spring of 1983, life in Cedar Hollow felt steady. Church bells rang on time. The river still froze every January and thawed by April. Children rode bikes down Main Street without helmets. The diner smelled like coffee and bacon grease. The town carried on, unaware that one of its stories had already begun to unravel. Above the flower shop, Evelyn Hart closed her ledger, turned off the lamp, and looked out the window. Snowflakes floated past the streetlight, catching in the dark. She thought of her next tutoring class, of the papers waiting on her desk, of nothing at all. Then she set her alarm for 6, folded her jacket over the chair again, and went to sleep. By this time next night, that jacket and everything it carried would begin the longest silence Cedar Hollow had ever known. The morning of March 12, 1983, began like any other in Cedar Hollow. Thin sunlight filtered through the blinds above Hart's Flowers, striping Evelyn's kitchen table in gold and shadow. The kettle whistled once, then quieted. She poured tea, tore a corner from the newspaper, and circled a crossword clue without finishing it. She never did finish crosswords. Outside, Main Street still wore its thin coat of frost. A mail truck idled near the curb, exhaust curling up like breath. From her window, Evelyn could see the reflection of her own shop sign, swinging in the wind, Hearts Flowers, Est, 1978. She straightened her collar, buttoned her coat, and descended the narrow staircase that connected her apartment to the shop below. By 7:30, the first customer was already waiting, a woman from the church, needing lilies for Sunday service. "Morning, Evelyn," the woman said. "Morning, Mrs. Kent," Evelyn replied, with her usual small smile. That was Evelyn. Never rushed, never flustered, precise even in kindness. She wrapped the lilies in paper, tied them with twine, and slipped a small white card inside. On the back of the receipt she scribbled, "Paid in full." At 9 sharp, she unlocked the side door for deliveries. The driver, a heavy-set man with sawdust on his sleeves, dropped off boxes of tulips and carnations. They exchanged pleasantries about the weather, still cold, maybe snow later, and then she was alone again. The smell of earth and stems filled the room. By noon, she'd arranged 3 funeral orders, 2 anniversary bouquets, and a single white lily. That one she sold to Thomas Dyer. He came in just after lunch, wearing his brown work jacket zipped to the throat. He nodded at her display table. "Something simple," he said. "For a friend." Evelyn wrapped the lily, wrote his name on the order slip, and rang up the sale. They didn't speak again. He left without change. It was the last confirmed conversation Evelyn Hart ever had. The rest of her day was routine. At 4, she closed early to teach her evening GED class at Cedar Hollow High. She carried her lesson notes in a worn leather satchel, pages marked with pencil and tea stains. Students remembered her walking into the classroom, her hair pinned up, her cardigan too thin for the weather. She smiled when one of them complained about Shakespeare. "Not everything has to be easy to be good," she said. That line stuck with them for years. Class ended at 7:30. She stayed behind to erase the chalkboard and stack the chairs. By 8, she was seen locking the school door and heading toward her bicycle, parked under the streetlight. The janitor, Bill Maddox, watched her from the doorway as she pedaled off. He'd later tell police she turned onto Main Street, coat collar up, satchel hanging from her shoulder. He said she waved once, a small motion against the cold. He didn't think much of it then. By 8:40, the lights inside Hearts Flowers flickered back on. A passerby, June, her weekend helper, saw Evelyn through the window, rearranging vases near the front counter. She looked distracted, maybe tired. June waved, but Evelyn didn't notice. Inside, she was writing in her ledger, noting down her orders for Monday. On the back counter sat the tweed jacket she'd meant to mend, a seam split along the sleeve. She planned to take it to Mendel's tailor in the morning before opening the shop. The tailor, Arthur Mendel, closed at 9 sharp every night. She'd left it too late. The neon sign buzzed overhead, one of its pink letters fading in and out. Outside, the street had emptied. Wind rolled paper wrappers down the curb. When Evelyn flipped the sign to closed, the bell above the door gave its faint metallic ring. That was the last sound she made in her shop. Later, a waitress at the diner across the street thought she saw Evelyn heading toward the square, her coat collar turned up, head bowed against the wind. Another witness, a teenager walking home from the bus stop, remembered a man standing near the tailor shop doorway, smoking. He couldn't describe the face, only that the glow of the cigarette moved when the woman passed. Neither detail made sense at the time. Together, they would form the last known minutes of Evelyn Hart's life. At 10:30, the lights in the flower shop window were still off. The bicycle leaned against the wall where she'd left it. A drizzle had started, tapping the awning above her display of potted violets. By midnight, the rain turned to sleet. Cedar Hollow slept under the hiss of it. And Evelyn Hart was gone. When she didn't open the shop the next morning, people noticed fast. By 9, the bell hadn't rung once. By 10, Mrs. Kent knocked on the locked glass door and peered through the window. The counter looked normal, flowers and water, register closed, notes scattered. But Evelyn's coat still hung on the chair. The jacket she'd meant to mend was gone. At 11, Sheriff Dale Murphy got the call. He sent Deputy Lowell to check the apartment upstairs. The bed was made. The teacup from the night before still sat in the sink. No sign of struggle. "No, Evelyn." They found her bicycle still leaning by the wall, chain glistening from the rain. Keys on the floor, just inside the shop door. Everything in place, except the person who kept it that way. By sunset, the news had traveled through every diner booth and church pew in Cedar Hollow. The florist hadn't come home. By nightfall, search parties were forming. Men from the hardware store. Teens from the high school. Mothers, with flashlights wrapped in plastic bags to keep out the rain. They fanned out across the outskirts, calling her name into the wind. They didn't know it then, but they were calling toward a culvert 3 miles north, where the runoff water whispered beneath the road. 2 days later, that's where she'd be found. And among the mud and reeds, a single button from her tweed jacket waited quiet proof that small details can outlast the living. The morning of March 14th began gray and wet, the kind of chill that sank into the bones. Just after 7, a county road crew pulled their truck to the shoulder of Route 12. They were clearing winter debris from the drainage ditch's branches, bottles, the slow remains of snow. One of them, a young worker named Sean Riley, spotted fabric snagged on a branch in the runoff. At first, he thought it was a tarp. Then he saw hair. He called for his supervisor. Within minutes, Sheriff Dale Murphy was on scene. They found her where the culvert dipped under the road, half submerged in cold, slow water. Evelyn Hart, still in her coat. Her bicycle key still in her pocket. The image that stayed with them wasn't blood or violence. It was her hand, one glove missing, fingers curled toward the surface as if trying to rise. The sheriff ordered the area sealed. A radio crackled for backup. The drizzle hadn't stopped. Rain turned the mud to paste around their boots. Deputy Lowell stood by the edge of the culvert, notebook wet and useless. He'd known Evelyn since she moved to town. He'd bought flowers from her twice, once for his mother's birthday, once for his wife's apology. He couldn't bring himself to write a word. The coroner arrived from Albany by noon. He crouched near the water, his breath white in the cold air. The body showed no signs of robbery. Her jewelry was intact. Wallet still zipped in her purse. The cause, he said, was blunt trauma to the head, likely from behind. One blow, deliberate and clean. No defensive wounds. No sign she'd struggled. The killer had known what he was doing. A few feet from the body, a faint shoe print pressed into the mud, half filled with rainwater. They photographed it from 3 angles, cast it in plaster, bagged it. Near the print, another detail, a button, brown with a cracked edge, lying against a tangle of reeds. It matched the jacket Evelyn always wore. But the jacket itself was gone. That missing jacket would become the ghost of the investigation. By evening, yellow tape fluttered along the roadside. The news spread faster than the rain. Reporters from Albany arrived with tripods and umbrellas, their headlights cutting through the mist. The sheriff gave one statement, short, careful, and tired. An active investigation is underway. We ask the public to remain patient. He didn't say her name, but everyone already knew. At the diner, the cook turned down the radio. At the post office, the clerk stared out at the rain and didn't speak. At Hart's Flowers, June stood behind the counter and refused to turn the sign from closed to open. The shop smelled like wilted stems and rain-soaked soil. That night, Cedar Hollow went to bed early. The streets emptied before 10. No one wanted to be out in the dark where the sound of water reminded them of that culvert. The next morning, investigators combed the site again. They moved slow, deliberate, methodical. Plastic flags marked every footprint, every cigarette butt, every scrap of cloth. They sifted through the mud with gloved hands. By mid-afternoon, they had bagged 3 items: the button, a length of torn fabric, and a cigarette filter too waterlogged for prints. Each piece went into evidence under clear plastic, tagged and logged. At the sheriff's office, they spread the items across a table under fluorescent light. Murphy stared at them for a long time. A button, a scrap of tweed, a faint shoe print. No blood, no weapon, no suspect. The lab results wouldn't come for weeks, and even then, small-town resources were thin. They sent the cast of the Tread to Albany, but nobody expected much. The county crime lab was 3 technicians deep and 6 months behind. All Murphy could do was keep the case alive long enough for the right eyes to find it. That night, the sheriff visited Evelyn's apartment above the flower shop. The air smelled faintly of dust and lilies. A cup sat in the sink, ringed with tea stains. Her ledger lay open on the kitchen table. He thumbed through pages filled with looping handwriting names, dates, delivery addresses. Nothing suspicious. On one page, near the bottom, a faint smear of what looked like pencil rubbed smooth. He couldn't read it. He didn't try to. He just closed the book and left it on the table. Outside, the rain had stopped, but puddles mirrored the streetlights. He looked up at the window where Evelyn used to stand and watch the square. In that silence, for the first time, Cedar Hollow felt bigger than it was and far less safe. The autopsy report arrived 3 days later. The blow had fractured her skull. The angle suggested she was sitting or kneeling when it landed. No foreign fibers. No fingerprints. No DNA, they didn't call it that yet. Just trace elements. Dust, plant matter, faint traces of iron. The coroner noted a thin cut near her shoulder where a seam had split. He bagged a few threads of brown fabric for analysis. They'd go missing from the evidence room by summer. The sheriff logged his final report that night. Murder by unknown assailant. No witnesses. No suspects. Open and unsolved. He didn't know that the jacket, the one piece missing, was already far from Cedar Hollow, folded in a box that would outlive them all. By the week's end, the culvert was dry again. The county road crew came back to finish clearing the ditch. They worked quiet, not looking toward the spot where she'd been found. Sean Riley, the young man who first saw the fabric, refused to return to that stretch of road ever again. He told his supervisor it was cursed. No one argued. In the years that followed, the rain would wash away the last traces of plaster and tape. Grass would grow over the disturbed soil. The road would crack, patched, and crack again. Cars would pass, oblivious. But under the earth, where the reeds still bent toward the water, the story of Evelyn Hart waited unfinished, patient, and cold. The first day after the discovery was a blur of sirens and whispers. Cedar Hollow woke to the sound of helicopters circling low over the tree line. Reporters parked outside the diner, cameras aimed at the square. The headline on the Hollow Gazette read only 4 words: "Local florist found dead." Below it, a black and white photograph of Evelyn Hart, cropped from a church newsletter. She was smiling, but the print grain made her eyes look far away. By mid-morning, volunteers had gathered at the fire station. Farmers, store clerks, high school students on spring break, all there because it felt wrong to stay home. Sheriff Murphy stood on the flatbed of a pickup truck, reading names from a clipboard. He divided the search grid into sectors: North Ridge, the creek bed, the woods behind the old quarry. Everyone was to report anything: footprints, fabric, tire tracks, tools, trash. He thanked them and reminded them to stay safe, though the words sounded small against the hum of engines. The search began at noon. Rain had eased, but the ground was slick and black. Men in bright vests moved through the trees, calling Evelyn's name even though they knew she couldn't answer. Dogs barked at every echo. Flashlights cut thin paths of white through the gray. From above, the forest must have looked like a field of fireflies moving in slow circles. At the flower shop, June and a few women from town scrubbed the counters and washed the vases. They couldn't stand to see the place sit dark. They said they were cleaning for her, but really, they were cleaning for themselves. The scent of lilies hung heavy, sweet enough to sting. Someone started crying and didn't stop for a long time. The sheriff's office was a different kind of noise. Phones rang without pause. Reporters demanded comment. Family members came and went: Evelyn's sister from Albany, her cousin from Syracuse. Deputy Lowell sat at his desk, typing notes that felt like lies. Time of discovery. Condition of remains. Witness statements pending. Each line felt smaller than what had been lost. That evening, Sheriff Murphy stood at the culvert again. The tape still fluttered. Floodlights threw long shadows against the wet road. He crouched and pressed a gloved hand into the soft ground where the plaster cast had been taken. He didn't know what he was looking for, just the feeling that something was missing. He found a small shard of glass, clear, curved like a lens. He slipped it into a bag. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. For 3 days, the search spread outward. Helicopters swept the river. Divers searched the shallows. No weapon. No sign of a struggle beyond the single shoe print. Theories multiplied in the absence of evidence. Some said it was a drifter, passing through on the highway. Others whispered about someone closer, someone local. In a town this small, closer was everyone. By the fourth day, the press had turned cruel. One headline read, "Florist's Secret Life?" Another speculated about affairs, debts, hidden lovers. They printed photographs of her apartment window, her shop door, the culvert. People stopped buying papers but read them anyway. Murphy tried to control it, but control was gone. He held a press conference in front of the courthouse, his uniform soaked with rain. "We are pursuing multiple leads," he said. "No suspect has been ruled out." When a reporter asked if that included townspeople, he hesitated just long enough for rumor to take root. That night, the diner buzzed with the sound of low voices. A waitress whispered that she'd seen Evelyn talking to a man outside the tailor's shop the night she disappeared. Someone else said they'd heard an argument near the square raised voices, a car door slamming. By midnight, every face in town had been mentioned once. Every husband, every neighbor, every stranger who'd passed through. June went home and locked her doors. She turned on every light in the house and slept in the living room with a baseball bat beside her. Across town, the tailor, Arthur Mendel, sat alone in his workshop surrounded by the smell of mothballs and chalk dust. He stared at the ledger on his counter, the same one that would one day solve the case, and felt a tightness in his chest he couldn't name. He told himself it was grief. It was also memory. By the end of the week, the official search was scaled back. The state police left. Volunteers returned to work. Rain gave way to snow, and footprints disappeared under white. Murphy stood in his office, looking at a map pinned with flags. Every color meant another dead end. He visited Evelyn's shop one last time before sealing it. He turned the sign to closed, locked the door, and taped the key inside an envelope marked "Evidence." He left the lights off. Through the window, he could still see her reflection in his mind, head bent, ribbon in hand, arranging flowers for a customer who would never come back. The panic quieted, but it didn't fade. It settled into the town like fog, something you could live with, but never see through. Parents started walking their kids to school. People locked doors that had stayed open for years. Strangers were noticed now, cataloged by the hour they appeared and which direction they left. Cedar Hollow had learned fear. For Evelyn's family, the days became ritual. Mornings at the sheriff's office, evenings at the church. Her sister begged for updates that never came. The sheriff could only promise that he was trying. Trying wasn't enough. By April, the case file had grown thick with notes but thin on truth. And in a back room of the police station, the torn fabric from her jacket sat in an evidence bag, marked and forgotten. The label read, "Property of Evelyn Hart, recovered near Route 12 culvert." No one noticed that the tag on the bag was missing a single inventory number. A small clerical error. A gap that would stretch 40 years before anyone thought to fill it. When spring finally came to Cedar Hollow, the grass along Route 12 grew tall enough to hide the scar where the road had been dug up. The flowers in the square bloomed bright that year. June planted them herself, one by one, in front of the shop that still bore Evelyn's name. She told people it was to honor her friend. But privately, she said it was to keep the ghosts busy. And if you stood there at night, when the wind moved through the trees and the traffic lights blinked red on empty streets, you might hear the faint echo of that search. Boots in the mud, voices calling into nothing, a name carried out into the dark. By April, the search for Evelyn Hart had slowed to a crawl. The snow melted, the river swelled, and with it came silence heavy, patient, merciless. Cedar Hollow returned to its routines, but the rhythm was off. Every slammed door sounded like a gunshot. Every unfamiliar car drew eyes to windows. The sheriff's office still took calls, though fewer each week. A sighting here, a confession there, all dissolving under daylight. The file thickened with false starts. Each page ended the same way, unsubstantiated, no further action. Murphy kept a corkboard above his desk, maps, photos, handwritten notes pinned in messy clusters. At its center was Evelyn's picture. He'd tacked it there the night after the funeral, and for months, it stared back at him with the same calm expression she'd worn in every photo. Even in death, she looked composed. He hated that. Rumors filled the gaps the facts left behind. The diner became their exchange floor. People leaned in close, speaking just above the hum of the coffee machine. She'd been seeing someone. She had debts. She wanted to leave town. She wasn't who she said she was. No one had proof, but proof wasn't required. In small towns, suspicion is its own currency. By summer, the story had changed so many times it barely resembled itself. Some said Evelyn had a secret lover from Albany. Others swore a drifter passed through the week she died. One theory even named a deputy quiet, single, too interested in the case. Each rumor spread like ivy, choking the truth until no one could see it anymore. Sheriff Murphy tried to keep order, but his own men were fraying. Deputy Lowell took leave. Another officer quit outright, citing burnout. Murphy stayed, working longer hours, driving the same stretch of Route 12 until the road felt like punishment. He told himself the answer was out there somewhere, waiting for him to notice it. But the road never spoke back. Inside the evidence room, the collected pieces of Evelyn Hart's last hours sat in numbered boxes. Box 1, photographs of the culvert and surrounding area. Box 2, the plaster tread cast, edges chipped. Box 3, personal items from her apartment ledger, teacup, keys, receipts. Box 4, fabric scrap and button marked unknown jacket. Murphy didn't realize that Box 4's contents had been filed under the wrong case number. It would stay that way for nearly 40 years. For now, it was just another artifact in a room of unclaimed ghosts. In July, the county coroner called. The lab had finished with the trace materials found on Evelyn's coat. Plant fibers, dust, and a sliver of something metallic iron oxide mixed with oil residue, likely from machinery. Murphy drove to the lumber mill outside town, thinking maybe the killer had worked there. He interviewed foremen, workers, truck drivers. All of them polite. All of them useless. That's where he met Thomas Dyer for the first time. Dyer was quiet, thin, always looking at the floor when he talked. He worked maintenance tools, wiring, motors. When asked where he'd been the night Evelyn vanished, he said he'd been home fixing a radio. He even offered to show it to the sheriff, as though proof of hobby was proof of innocence. Murphy left unconvinced but without evidence. In his report, he wrote only 2 words beside Dyer's name, not relevant. It was a decision he'd regret until his last day in uniform. By August, the case had burned through every lead. The FBI declined to assist, too local, too small. The state police closed their file. The town moved on out of necessity, not peace. But not everyone could forget. June kept Evelyn's shop open for a few months, selling the leftover flowers until the petals turned brown. Then she locked the door for good and left town. Arthur Mendel, the tailor, stopped opening on Sundays. He told customers his eyes were failing, but really, he just didn't like walking past the empty flower shop. The bell above his door sounded lonelier now. At the church, attendance rose briefly. Then it, too, faded. Faith bends easily when fear sits in the front pew. In early September, a break came, or seemed to. A hiker found a torn sleeve near the quarry outside town, same tweed pattern as Evelyn's jacket. Murphy rushed the fabric to the lab. It wasn't hers. Different thread count, different weave. Another dead end. The sheriff's corkboard grew crowded, until it looked less like an investigation and more like a map of obsession. Evelyn's face sat at the center, surrounded by lines that led nowhere. Each morning, he'd stand before it with his coffee, hoping something new would appear overnight. Nothing ever did. By the first frost, even the rumor mill had gone quiet. People spoke of her less, not out of disinterest but fatigue. Grief had turned to routine. The square was decorated for Christmas that year, same as always, lights draped over the lampposts. Only one thing changed. The flowers beneath the town's statue were fake now. Plastic. They wouldn't wilt, and they wouldn't remind anyone of Evelyn Hart. The sheriff filed his final report on December 18, 1983. Case remains open. No new leads. Review pending upon discovery of additional evidence. He slid the file into the drawer beside others just like it. Then he turned off the light and went home. Outside, snow began to fall again, quiet, slow, forgiving. And somewhere in Cedar Hollow, the missing jacket lay folded inside a cardboard box in a tailor's attic, waiting for time to do what people could not remember. Winter bled into spring, and the case of Evelyn Hart drifted into the background noise of Cedar Hollow. The flower shop stayed dark. The paper stopped printing updates. Even the gossip cooled, settling into the cracks of daily life like dust no one bothered to sweep. In the sheriff's office, the file lived on a lower shelf, too painful to throw away, too dead to touch. Every few months, Sheriff Murphy pulled it out, read through the same notes, and closed it again. He started keeping his jacket on the back of his chair at night, as if leaving would admit defeat. He retired in 1986, 3 years after Evelyn's murder, and the case went with him. His replacement, a younger man named Harold Doone, inherited the unsolved file and the silence that came with it. Evelyn's family held a memorial that first spring. The church filled beyond its walls, standing room only, the air thick with flowers. Lilies, roses, carnations, daisies, an ocean of color for a woman who once gave color to everyone else's days. Her mother sat in the front pew, clutching a handkerchief embroidered with Evelyn's initials. The minister's voice trembled when he said her name. He didn't call it murder. He called it a tragedy. It was easier that way. Afterward, they placed a small stone at the edge of the cemetery, near the sycamore trees. It read, Evelyn Marie Hart, 1954 1983. Loved, missed, never forgotten. But memory is slippery. It fades, even when people promise it won't. By 1987, new faces filled the town's old storefronts. The diner got a fresh coat of paint. The hardware store changed owners. Arthur Mendel, the tailor, grew slower with his hands but never closed his shop. He kept his ledgers stacked neatly by year, tied with twine and labeled in pencil. The one from 1983 sat on the bottom shelf, spine cracked, dust collecting in the grooves of its cover. He never opened it again. Sometimes, on quiet afternoons, he'd think of the girl who ran the flower shop 2 doors down. He'd remember her soft voice, the way she always said, "Thank you," twice, once when handing over payment, and again when taking back her repaired clothes. He never forgot the last piece she'd brought in, a brown tweed jacket with a torn sleeve. He'd fixed it, written a repair code on the tag like always M317, and put it on the hook behind his counter. She never came back to pick it up. The years rolled on. Cedar Hollow changed shape, but not size. Children grew up, moved away, and left their parents in houses that felt too big. The mill closed in 1991. Half the town lost work, the other half lost patience. Murphy, long retired, moved to Florida, leaving behind the cold and the ghosts. He died in 1999, still believing Evelyn Hart's killer was a stranger who'd passed through one night and never came back. He was half right. By the time the new millennium arrived, the Hart case had become a story told by older locals to newcomers, half cautionary tale, half urban legend. The florist who vanished, the one they found in the culvert. Details blurred. Some said she was never found at all. Some said she'd been buried in her own flower shop. The truth was quieter, too ordinary to keep alive. But for a few people, forgetting wasn't an option. June Parker, Evelyn's friend and part-time employee, never stopped visiting her grave. Every March, she brought a bouquet of white tulips, tied with a single yellow ribbon. She'd talk to Evelyn as if she were still behind the counter, as if the shop might open again any day. She'd tell her about the weather, about the town's gossip, about how the square still smelled faintly of her flowers when it rained. Then she'd stand in silence until her knees began to ache, and she'd whisper, "We still don't know." After June passed away in 2011, the caretaker noticed that someone else had continued the ritual. The tulips still appeared every March, always tied the same way. No one ever saw who left them. Time erodes memory, but it preserves things too, objects, fibers, names, written in fading ink. In 2006, Cedar Hollow built a small history exhibit in the library basement. One of the items on display was a photograph of Hart's flowers from 1982. Evelyn behind the counter, ribbon in hand, mid-laugh. Underneath the frame, a small plaque read, "Local businesses through the decades." There was no mention of her death. The past was easier to keep pretty when the ugly parts were left off. Then came the slow, accidental chain of events that would bring everything back. In 2017, after Arthur Mendel's death, his grandson cleaned out the old tailor shop. He found boxes of cloth scraps, chalk sticks turned to dust, and stacks of ledgers tied with brittle string. Most went into trash bags. A few were boxed for donation to the thrift store across the river. One of those boxes contained the 1,983 ledger. And somewhere inside, folded neatly beside a handful of unclaimed garments, was a brown tweed jacket with a small tag inside the lining. A repair code written in fading pencil, M317. The jacket would sit there for 5 more years, waiting for someone to notice it. Cedar Hollow didn't talk much about Evelyn anymore, but the town had never really recovered. There were still people who locked their doors twice. Still parents who told their daughters not to walk home alone after dark. Still whispers about the flower lady when new faces moved in. But mostly, Cedar Hollow just kept living quietly, politely, stubbornly. The way small towns do when they've learned that tragedy doesn't end. It just settles in like weather. In the end, it wasn't justice or guilt or even grief that kept the story alive. It was patience. The kind that lasts decades. The kind that hides in the attic of an old tailor's shop, written in a hand too careful to fade completely. Time would finally catch up in 2022 when a thrift store clerk unboxed that jacket and ran her fingers along the seam. She'd feel a bump, a ridge of thread where there shouldn't be one, and tug gently. And what came loose would change everything Cedar Hollow thought it knew about Evelyn Hart's death. But before that, before the code, the prints, the trial there, were only the cold years. And the silence that comes when everyone believes the story is over. It started quietly. No thunderclap, no headline. Just a small thrift store on the edge of the Hudson, a slow Tuesday morning, and a box marked Mendel's Taylor Estate, written in faded ink. The clerk on duty that day, a woman named Carla Ruiz, was 26. She'd been sorting donations since the store opened boxes of old clothes, chipped mugs, a typewriter, missing keys. The Mendel box was just another chore. She slit the tape, lifted the flaps, and began stacking clothes onto the intake table. Most were ordinary wool coats, a few shirts, a rolled-up measuring tape turned brittle with age. Then she unfolded a brown tweed jacket. It smelled faintly of cedar and dust. The lining was soft but uneven, as if someone had repaired it by hand. She ran her thumb along the seam and felt a ridge, a lump under the fabric. She pinched, tugged gently, and a small piece of cloth thread loosened. That's when she saw the mark, faint, penciled, nearly invisible. M317. Carla almost tossed it aside. To her, it looked like a dry cleaner's code. But something about the way it was written, the careful, old-fashioned script, made her pause. She slipped her phone from her pocket, took a picture, and sent it to her boss with a note. Weird tag, maybe vintage? The jacket went onto a hanger, priced at $12, and placed on the front rack. It might have stayed there forever, if not for an errand that afternoon. Arthur Mendel's nephew, David, walked into the thrift store 2 hours later. He was on his way home from the lawyer's office, paperwork still in hand. He'd grown up in his uncle's shop but hadn't been inside in years. When he saw the jacket, he froze. He recognized the stitching, the herringbone pattern his uncle used for test repairs. He reached for the tag, squinting at the pencil code. M317. His stomach dropped. He didn't know why, only that the number felt familiar. He told the clerk he'd like to buy the jacket, paid the $12, and left with the hanger still in his hand. At home, he dug through the boxes of ledgers he'd kept from the shop's cleanup. It took him half an hour to find the one labeled 1,983. The ledger was bound in cracked leather, pages yellowed and stiff. He flipped through slowly, eyes scanning the columns. Date, repair code, client initials, cost. Then he found it. The 11th of March, 1983. M317. Dyer, T. David stared at the name. He didn't know who Dyer was, but he knew the date. March 11th. 2 days before Evelyn Hart disappeared. He sat there a long time, the ledger open on his knees, heart thudding like a second clock in the room. Then he made a call to the sheriff's office in Cedar Hollow. The evidence transfer happened the next day. 2 deputies from the cold case unit arrived to collect the jacket and the ledger. They logged it as potential link Hart case, 1,983. Both items were driven under seal to Albany's forensic lab. For 39 years, the Hart case had sat dormant. Now, under the fluorescence of a lab that didn't exist back then, the old evidence breathed again. The jacket was placed under alternate light sources, infrared, ultraviolet, laser. The seam, once torn, revealed more than just thread. Near the hem, a partial palm print emerged, oils and residue preserved between fabric layers. Too faint for the technology of 1983, but not for now. Modern image enhancement mapped ridges invisible to the naked eye. The analyst labeled it sample, a recovered print. They ran it through the state database. No match. Then through the National AFIS network. This time the result blinked onto the screen with quiet finality. Match found: Dyer, Thomas, 1984, misdemeanor, possession of stolen goods. Detective Erin Wallace of the Cedar Hollow Sheriff's Office was the first to read the report. She'd grown up in town. Her mother had gone to school with Evelyn. When she saw the match, she stopped breathing for a few seconds. Then she picked up the phone. "Get me a warrant," she said. 40 years late is still on time. The search of Thomas Dyer's house happened 3 days later. It was a small two-story at the edge of town, the same one he'd bought in 1982. He lived alone now, retired, collecting radios and fixing clocks. When the detectives knocked, he didn't seem surprised. He opened the door, wiping oil from his hands. "About time," he said. Inside, the air smelled like dust and solder. Shelves lined with transistor radios buzzed faintly, all tuned to static. The search team moved methodically. Closet, attic, basement. They found the old work boots in a storage bin, soles cracked but intact. A forensic technician compared them to the cast from the culvert. Same tread pattern, same wear on the outer heel. A perfect match. In the basement, behind a shelf of spare parts, they found an evidence of another kind. A small wooden box with a broken hinge. Inside, pressed between yellowing newspaper clippings, was a photograph: Evelyn Hart, standing in her shop, smiling. Folded neatly behind it, a handwritten note in faded ink. "For repairs, M317, A.M." When they arrested Thomas Dyer, it didn't make noise. No cameras. No crowd. Just 2 detectives, 1 warrant, and a man who had run out of time. He didn't protest. He didn't ask what they found. He only said, "You think you know everything." He was right for a moment. They didn't know the why yet, just the how. That would come later, in a courtroom where silence mattered more than answers. Back at the lab, the jacket and ledger became the backbone of a case that had slept longer than some of the investigators had been alive. They retested everything that had once been considered useless: the plaster tread, the button, even the scrap of glass found near the culvert. The glass turned out to be from a radio dial, one that matched the model Dyer had repaired in 1983. Piece by piece, the story stitched itself back together. Evelyn's jacket had been altered by Dyer, taken under the pretense of fixing a seam. He'd never returned it. When she confronted him about it, perhaps that night outside the tailor's shop, it had ended in violence. One blow. One body in a culvert. One mistake, buried under time. And one small code, written by a tailor who never thought his handwriting would one day solve a murder. When Detective Wallace drove back into Cedar Hollow that evening, the town looked the same as it had in every photograph. Same narrow streets, same diner, same blinking light at the square. Only the air felt different, thinner, lighter, like something had finally broken loose. 40 years had passed since the florist vanished. Now the story had a pulse again. And though no one said it out loud, everyone felt the same thing. Justice doesn't expire, it just waits for someone to notice the details. In the courthouse, the ledger sat on display, sealed behind glass, open to that one page. The pencil line was barely visible now, but under the right light, you could still read it. M317 Dyer, T. A single stroke of graphite that turned memory into evidence. The town gathered that week for a press conference. Reporters filled the same square where Evelyn used to sell flowers. Sheriff Wallace stood behind the microphone. Her voice was steady. "An arrest has been made in the 1983 murder of Evelyn Hart," she said. Sometimes, the smallest detail is the loudest truth. The cameras clicked. The rain began again. And Cedar Hollow, for the first time in 40 years, exhaled. The day after the arrest, the Cedar Hollow Sheriff's Office turned into a museum of old evidence. Boxes, long untouched, were stacked across desks. Plastic bags clouded with time hung from wire racks. What had once been a room of ghosts was now alive again. Every tag, every scrap, every mislabeled fragment pulled from storage for the first time in decades. Detective Aaron Wallace stood in the middle of it all, gloved hands hovering over the files like a priest at an altar. The jacket and ledger were only the beginning. She knew the key to conviction wouldn't be nostalgia, it would be science. And for the first time since 1983, science finally had the tools to listen. The forensic lab in Albany handled the re-examination. Inside a temperature-controlled room, the tweed jacket lay flat under an LED scanner the size of a dinner table. Technicians moved with the precision of surgeons. Every fiber was photographed in layers, visible light, infrared, ultraviolet, each wavelength revealing a new layer of history. Where human eyes saw brown fabric, the scanner saw worlds, micro-residues of skin oil, dust, and iron oxide trapped between threads. Those residues mattered. They told a story Evelyn couldn't anymore. Lab director Dr. Helena Krauss, a quiet woman with steel-gray hair, leaned over the screen as the computer rendered the palm print in spectral detail. Ridge by ridge, the lines appeared like a ghost surfacing. She watched the system's pattern recognition lock onto each spiral, then overlap it with the digital record from the database. A perfect alignment. Thomas Dyer's print. She took a breath. 39 years, she murmured. The technician beside her nodded without looking up. Patience pays better than money, he said. Back in Cedar Hollow, Detective Wallace combed through the old inventory sheets. The original crime scene evidence log had a gap, a missing inventory number between 83 to 042 and 83 to 044. The jacket fragment, she realized, had been filed under that empty slot. Someone in 1983 had written unknown fabric and accidentally skipped the number. That single oversight had buried the clue that could have solved the case back when disco was still on the radio. She stared at the page for a long time. How many other stories die in the margins, she whispered. Her partner, Deputy Ray Larkin, looked over her shoulder. Probably more than we'll ever know, he said. Then he grinned faintly. But not this one. The boot tread was next. For decades, it had sat in a brittle plaster cast, wrapped in newspaper. Modern technology had a different way to read it. Using a 3D laser scanner, forensic analysts digitized the cast, mapping every ridge, nick, and wear pattern. They compared it to the boots taken from Dyer's basement, a pair of size 10s, cracked at the heel. Even after 40 years, the match was flawless. The tread pattern, rare for its model year, showed an identical chip on the left outer edge. The lab report phrased it clinically: high probability correlation, exceeding 99.8% confidence. In plain language, it meant only one thing. The boots that stood in Dyer's closet had once stood at the edge of Evelyn Hart's grave. The sheriff's office built the case piece by piece. Each old oversight became a new weapon. They reprocessed the photograph negatives from the original scene, converting them into digital files. One image, grainy and underexposed, showed a faint reflection in the water near the culvert. The light caught something metallic. When magnified and filtered, the reflection revealed the shape of a car bumper. A 1980 Ford sedan, Dyer's make and model. The license plate wasn't visible, but the distance between the taillights matched measurements from his registration record. It wasn't proof alone, but it built pressure, one more stitch in a tightening net. The district attorney's office in Albany assigned prosecutor Linda Rouse to the case. She'd handled cold cases before, but none this old. When she arrived at the evidence review meeting, she carried only a pen and a yellow legal pad. She listened as Wallace laid out the chain of custody, the print match, the tread, the photograph. Then she tapped her pen on the pad and asked one question. What about motive? Silence filled the room. The one question technology couldn't answer. Wallace flipped through her notes. They'd interviewed old co-workers from the lumber mill, neighbors, church members. Everyone remembered Dyer as polite, quiet, forgettable. Except for one. June Parker's niece, who had helped at Hart's Flowers the week before Evelyn's death, recalled a conversation between Evelyn and Dyer. She'd overheard them arguing near the side alley, Evelyn saying something about the jacket not being ready, and Dyer replying that she shouldn't have come by after dark. No threats, no violence, just tension. But in hindsight, that was enough. Rouse nodded slowly. Jealousy, rejection, something personal. That's the story we tell the jury. The science tells the rest. Forensics took 6 months to complete. Every report came back the same: consistent, corroborative, irrefutable. The palm print inside the jacket was the keystone. The boot tread, the photo reflection, the ledger, all secondary pillars. Together, they built something stronger than theory: a timeline. The 11th of March 1983, Evelyn drops her jacket off at Mendel's tailor. Thomas Dyer signs for it under his name. Arthur Mendel's ledger confirms. March 12. She teaches her class, then stops by the shop after hours to pick it up. Dyer meets her outside. They argue. Sometime between 8:45 and 9:15, she dies. March 14. Her body is found in the culvert. The jacket is missing. And for 4 decades, the truth sleeps under layers of dust and silence. Until now. In November 2023, the DA's office filed charges against Thomas Dyer: second-degree murder, obstruction of justice, and evidence tampering. The trial was set for spring. For the first time, the name Evelyn Hart appeared again in the Albany News ticker. Not as a mystery, as a case number. The town reacted like waking from a long dream. Some were relieved, others angry it had taken so long. A few refused to believe it. Dyer had been their neighbor, their handyman, the quiet man who fixed radios for free. But facts don't need belief. They only need daylight. On a cold December morning, Detective Wallace stood outside Hart's Flowers. The shop had new owners now, but the sign still carried Evelyn's name. Through the window, tulips stood in neat rows under soft light. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a copy of the forensic summary, the one that finally tied the print to the lining. She folded it once, placed it in a small envelope, and slid it through the mail slot. No note. Just truth, delivered 40 years late. At the lab, Dr. Krauss logged her final entry. Case closed. She labeled the file, Hart, Evelyn, 1983, solved 2023. Then she turned off the light. The machines powered down with a low hum, leaving the room in silence. But on her desk, the jacket still lay under glass, threadbare and delicate. Its repair code M317, barely visible under the seam. It had outlasted everyone who once dismissed it as meaningless. Sometimes, Krauss thought, the past doesn't whisper. It waits. And when it's ready, it speaks in the language of evidence. The courtroom smelled of varnish and old paper. The benches creaked when people shifted. In the front row sat Evelyn Hart's remaining family, 2 generations removed but still carrying her photograph folded in a purse. 40 years had passed, yet the grief hadn't aged a day. At the defense table, Thomas Dyer sat in a plain gray suit that didn't fit. His hair had thinned, his shoulders slumped. He looked less like a monster and more like what he had always been, ordinary. He glanced toward the gallery once, eyes scanning the faces, as if trying to locate the version of himself who had belonged there before all of this began. Then he lowered his gaze to the table and didn't lift it again. Prosecutor Linda Rouse stood beside a stack of files that could fill a decade. Her case was methodical, precise, and relentless. It had to be. When your evidence spans 4 decades, your margin for doubt is microscopic. The state opened with the story everyone in Cedar Hollow thought they knew. The florist, the culvert, the rain. Then Rouse changed tempo. She brought the jury into the details: the missing jacket, the tailor's ledger, the palm print sealed in fabric for 40 years. She called the first witness Dr. Helena Krauss, forensic analyst. Krauss spoke plainly, like a teacher addressing a small classroom. She described how oil residues from a human hand could survive decades inside fabric seams when shielded from light and air. She explained the imaging techniques, the spectral reconstruction, the computer pattern matching that identified Dyer's palm. When Rouse held up a photo of the print on screen, the courtroom fell silent. Even from 20 feet away, the ridges were clear as fingerprints on glass. Rouse asked, "Can you say with certainty that this print belongs to the defendant?" Krauss nodded. Within a probability exceeding 1 in 200 billion. Defense counsel didn't object. He just shifted in his chair, a man drowning in arithmetic. Next came the tailor's ledger. The state introduced it like scripture. Pages yellowed, edges fragile, pencil handwriting looping across the lines. Arthur Mendel's nephew, David, took the stand to authenticate it. He pointed to the entry, the 11th of March, 1983, M317 Dyer, T. His voice trembled slightly. My uncle wrote those codes by hand. Every repair had one. There's no mistake. The defense tried to suggest that Dyer was a common name. Rouse countered with the matching repair tag inside the jacket, photographed under magnification, the same handwriting, same graphite composition, same fading. The jacket and ledger had spoken across 40 years, and both said the same thing. The boot evidence followed. Technicians displayed 3D renders of the plaster cast beside the scanned sole from Dyer's work boots. A split-screen overlay showed the identical chip on the outer heel. Jurors leaned forward, studying the lines. Rouse let the image linger. Sometimes, the best argument was silence with proof on the screen. Then came the photo, the reflection in the culvert water. It wasn't cinematic. Just a faint glint, barely there. But forensic comparison of the light spacing between tail lamps confirmed a match to Dyer's 1980 Ford sedan. Registered in his name. Never sold. Never reported stolen. Piece by piece, Rouse stitched the same story Evelyn's killer had tried to unmake. When Dyer's turn came, he surprised everyone by choosing to testify. He walked slowly to the stand, his hands shaking slightly, and adjusted the microphone. His voice was thin but steady. "I didn't kill her," he said. "I fixed her jacket. She came to pick it up late, after the shop was closed. We talked for a few minutes, that's all. She left alive." Rouse waited until the defense finished its questions, then stood. She didn't pace. She didn't raise her voice. She just looked at him and asked, "Mr. Dyer, if she left alive, why was your palm print inside the torn lining of her jacket?" Dyer blinked. "I must have left it while repairing it." "And why?" Rouse asked. "Was the jacket missing for 40 years, until it turned up in a box from your tailor's shop when every other order was picked up and paid for?" Dyer said nothing. Rouse pressed once more. "Did you ever return that jacket to Evelyn Hart?" His throat worked. He started to answer, then stopped. The silence stretched. When he finally spoke, it was barely audible. "No." Rouse nodded slowly. "Thank you." She turned and walked back to her table. The defense tried to cast doubt on the timeline. They called character witnesses, neighbors who said Dyer was quiet, helpful, gentle. But quiet and gentle don't erase fingerprints. They don't explain why Evelyn's coat never left his possession. They don't explain why a photograph of her had been found, decades later, hidden in his basement. Rouse closed with the simplest sentence of her career. The past doesn't forgive the present. After 2 days of deliberation, the jury returned. 12 people who hadn't been born when Evelyn died sat in a silence thicker than weather. The foreman's voice didn't tremble. "On the charge of second-degree murder, we find the defendant, Thomas Dyer, guilty." The courtroom air broke like glass. A sob came from the gallery, Evelyn's niece, hand over her mouth. Dyer didn't move. He just stared ahead, lips pressed tight, as if trying to swallow what was left of his life. Judge Ramirez read the sentence. 25 years to life. Dyer's shoulders sagged. He was let out the way he had lived quietly. When it was over, Detective Wallace stepped outside the courthouse. It was raining again, the same thin drizzle that had followed Evelyn Hart for 40 years. She didn't open an umbrella. She let it fall. Reporters crowded the steps, microphones raised, cameras rolling. Wallace gave one line, just one, before walking away. One forgotten jacket told the truth. That evening, Cedar Hollow held a vigil in the square. The new owners of Hart's Flowers placed white lilies by the fountain. The church bell rang 13 times, one for each hour Evelyn had been missing back in 1983. People stood under umbrellas and didn't speak. They didn't need to. The silence said everything. Afterward, someone taped a small note to the flower shop window. It read, "Justice doesn't end what was taken, but it keeps the story from ending wrong." And for the first time in decades, Cedar Hollow slept without locking every door. In the sheriff's office, the Hart case file was sealed and archived. Stamped in red, "Closed conviction." Detective Wallace placed it on the top shelf. Not the bottom, where forgotten cases go. The top where reminders live. Beside it, she left one item out of the box, a photocopy of the tailor's ledger page, M317 Dyer, T. She pinned it above her desk. A reminder that answers aren't found in miracles. They're found in the small things. The overlooked, the patient, and sometimes they're found in pencil. Cedar Hollow changed after the trial. Not in big ways. There were no parades, no speeches, no book deals. Just quieter mornings, fewer shadows at night. The weight that had sat over the town for 40 years finally shifted. Hart's Flowers reopened under a new name, but people still called it Evelyn's shop. On the counter, the owner kept a small frame with her photograph, Evelyn smiling, ribbon in hand. Below it, a brass tag engraved with 3 characters, M317. Detective Aaron Wallace stayed on the case only long enough to see Dyer sent to Greenhaven Prison. He never appealed, never spoke publicly. 2 months into his sentence, he died of heart failure in his sleep. When the warden called to inform her, Wallace only said, "Let the record close." But records never close completely. The Taylor's ledger was returned to the Mendel family. They placed it in a glass case at the Cedar Hollow Library, beside Evelyn's photo and a short note about the investigation. Tourists read the placard, shake their heads, and move on. Locals lower their voices when they pass it, as if not to wake something still alive inside. Because one question never left. The forensic team had found traces on the jacket that didn't belong to Dyer. A second partial print, too smudged to match, too faint to ignore. It could have been the Taylors'. It could have been Evelyn's. Or it could have been someone else entirely. The lab listed it simply as Unknown Contributor B. The case was closed anyway. Every March, the townspeople still leave flowers at the culvert on Route 12. White lilies. Always lilies. Rain or shine, someone places them in silence, ties them with a yellow ribbon, and walks away. No one claims credit. No one needs to. Because Cedar Hollow learned something from Evelyn Hart. That truth doesn't vanish. It just waits, stitched quietly into the seams of time, until someone finally pulls the thread.